Okay, switching back to good. So I'm going to talk a little bit about verbs and tense and aspect and a variety of other things in Uda. And I want to start by pulling up that. Oh, what happened to the formatting? Oh well. This is the same example that Katie showed you a moment ago. It's one of our favorite sentences out of that monkey story. And the wonderful thing about it, one of the many wonderful things about it, sorry for the formatting, is that it has 7 verbs in it, all in one sentence. We've confirmed with our speakers that you need all 7 of those verbs there to create both the meaning and the structure of this sentence. You can't stop anywhere in the middle of the sentence. So that's a lot of verbs. How do we explain them all? Hopefully I will get to most of them by the end of my little talk. Once again, sorry for the formatting issues. Tense and aspect. This is not an exhaustive list. In fact, when I was giving this presentation in practice yesterday, I was suddenly told by my speakers that no, that's not how you would say this. You would say this like this, and all of a sudden there was a new aspect in the language that we had never seen before. So our present tense, nle, is just our bare verb agreement that has been talked about before. And it also carries sort of a default perfect, I meant to change that to perfect meaning. So either I sleep or I have slept. The past, we get nka nle with this ka, but what you'll notice there is that we have 2 first-person singular agreements, indicating that this is something like an auxiliary verb happening before our main verb, sleep. And so that's I slept in the past. For the future, we don't get the double agreement, nanle. There we get this fully grammaticalized future marker. Very hard to see over in black in the bottom right is the immediate future. What we're calling the immediate future, we're not very convinced of that analysis, but it comes out as ndile. So again, if you can see, we have a first-person singular, and then we get this D marker that we think is like an immediate future. So again, there's only one agreement. It seems to be some fully grammaticalized marker, but here it's coming after the agreement rather than before with the main future. And then I have some stuff on the progressive, which is the point where my speakers told me that I was wrong yesterday. We have 2 things that may be the progressive. One involves reduplication of the verb stem, so nlele, repeating that syllable of the verb stem. And the other one involves this K markers, K-nle. And I'm sorry, I literally found out about those at dinner last night, so there's not much more that I can say about them. When we switch to the negative, there's one weird thing that happens that I want to call your attention to, which is that all of a sudden, the future form that we had in the affirmative is unavailable. We can't get manle as negative. We have to go with andile. So using this thing that looks like an immediate future as apparently our only option for negating. Serial verb constructions. So this is a general term used to describe this construction where you put many verbs into one sentence and they all work together to contribute to the meaning. Cross-linguistically, we mostly talk about 2 general classes of serial verb constructions. They're the serial verb constructions proper that are the main exemplar, where you have 2 verbs that share both a subject and an object. So we have this example sentence, ate iak ata. I think I must have been hungry when I was doing this solicitation session. Ate iak ata. Leland cooked and ate fish. The 2 verbs, cook, ate, and eat, ata, are both sharing. Leland is the subject, iak is the object, and the object comes between the 2. We also get covert coordination, which is the term used to describe multiple verbs that have distinct objects but are still sharing a subject. So it looks a bit more like sentences that we would translate using and in English, except that there's not an overt coordinator. And so here we have Leland akebe ngwerani osok Chris. Leland brought Chris the book, so Leland took the book, brought to Chris. In some languages, these 2 classes of serial verb-like things might function very differently. In Uda, they don't seem to. We pretty much get the same structure and meaning for both of these types. So for instance, when we start using adverbs, we see similar things in terms of adverb scope. So we can say, Leland, akebe ngwerani, osok Chris, pot is more or less only. And when you put that adverb at the end, we get an ambiguity in reading as to whether that adverb applies only to the second verb there, so only to osok Chris, which gives us an English clause something like, Leland brought the book only for Chris, or whether it's actually applying over to the subject of the sentence, more or less, so only Leland brought Chris the book. And the same thing, a very similar thing happens in serial verb constructions proper. Leland ate ata pop. When it's at the end, it applies to the action, which here is considered as a unit, apparently. Or it can give us a reading on the subject, like the first one. And there's another example down here at the bottom that you probably cannot see, which is where we take pot, so we can say, I'll just gesture here, Leland ate ya pot ata, putting the pot in the middle there. With serial verb constructions proper, this, at least in this example, that is giving the same reading as with it at the end. It disallows this reading where it's applying to the subject. So you can put it in the middle to get scope over the entire action. And similarly, we can say, Leland akebe ngwerani pot osok Chris, to say, Leland brought only the book. So now it's applying just to that verb. Tense and aspect, pretty much, this is one of the main places where serial verb constructions and covert coordination here, we can see that they're completely the same, or that they are mostly the same. They only allow one tense for the entire set of verbs. So you can't mark the tense on every verb. You can't mark it only on one of the later verbs. You can't mark different tenses on the verbs. We just get this future ma available at the very beginning. And similarly here with our aka, even though that looks like it's more like an auxiliary, it still has to come at the beginning of our whole string of main verbs. And this is one of the reasons that I say that it's an auxiliary rather than just another verb in our serial verb string, is that we can't get an adverb after it. So Leland aka pot ate yakata does not work. Whereas we could, with other verbs, separate them off using adverbs. So it's showing us that that past tense is some kind of auxiliary. It's not quite a full verb. But. And I don't have a slide for this, but similarly, negation behaves the same way. All the verbs need to be either affirmative or all negative. Since negation is shown by the agreement prefix on the verb, you won't see this explicitly most of the time. You'll just see that all of the agreements have the same polarity that way. Then we can start putting more verbs into our sentences. So Leland ate alaha ataya. Leland enjoys cooking and eating fish. Alaha is likes, more or less. Here, when we start putting in more verbs, it appears that the default position is for the object of the verb, the shared object of all of these verbs, to stay at the end. We can also move it up optionally. Although, for whatever reason here, it can't come after alaha, and that's one of many things in Uda that I cannot yet explain to you. So that brings us back to the monkey example. And we can start ticking off verbs and seeing which ones we now understand. This oko at the beginning is fairly easy. That's our matrix verb indicating recorded speech here. He said, more or less. Then we have walk, be out. Isangai walk. Which together are one meaning of walk around outside, to be out. So that looks like one of our two verbs, serial verb constructions proper, just with intransitive verbs. Then we go to ilong and ikong, which according to our speakers are a pair. They're together indicating the meaning of following. And they share this object, una, animal, which shows up between them like we would expect for a serial verb construction proper. So those verbs as a unit are apparently being covertly coordinated with our isangai wo that we had earlier to get us these four verbs in the embedded clause here. And that leaves only two verbs that I just can't explain to you yet. Wish I could. Thanks.
we're going to flirt with semantics for just a little bit. Talk a little bit about modals in Uda. So, again, I want to do an introduction for people who are not so linguistically inclined. What are modals? Well, they're a little bit like verbs, but they're not actually real verbs. And typically what they do is they set a mood for a sentence. So English examples would be could, must, can, should, where I can say, yeah, I can swim. And this means that can is adding the sense of ability to the sentence, where I swim is a totally valid sentence in English on its own. So we have exactly 2 identified modals in Uda, which is interesting because similar languages in the area would suggest that we should have 7 or 8, and all of our attempts to elicit pretty much anything mostly fell flat on their face. But we do have these 2. So we have adan, which is a deontic, so it means something roughly like have to. And, excuse me, we also have amadan, which is also a deontic, but it's a little less strong, so it's should. Again, this is quite interesting. If you have only 2 modals, why would you make them 2 deontics and not have any others? So that's a curious point. Just to show you a little bit about them working. So here's Adam, and this means I must swim. That's fairly straightforward. Equally, you have Amadan, Nwok, so I should swim, also fairly straightforward. But notice, neither of these are getting any sort of agreement. And all the agreement is back here. So that's part of what's telling us that this is a modal and not a verb, is it's not getting any sort of agreement. There is one little interesting thing here. So why would you have just agreement on that last thing and have this modal be totally separate? Well, there's evidence from an optional particle that you can put in here, which is C. C is totally optional, but always allowed. So what is it? Well, as I said previously, Nwok is an entirely valid sentence on its own. It has a verb, and the verb is fully inflected, so it's as if it has a subject. It's a totally valid sentence. So how are we going to test what's going on here? Well, we also have an optional subject pronoun, which Katie introduced to you, and that should always go at the very beginning of its clause. So if we put that in, it goes right there. So what this is suggesting is that we have Adam up here in a clause, and then we have totally separate clause that is on the Nwok. So C is probably a complementizer, and syntax is of Uda modals is, excuse the arrows, please. You have a modal that is the whole matrix clause in its own right and takes a full clausal complement. We also have one puzzle that I will work through rather quickly, and that's Akme Ini. So when we first stumbled across Akme Ini, it looked rather like a modal. So this means I might swim. And Akme Ini is actually 2 words, but they're functioning as a unit here. And again, you see the optional C behaves exactly the same, and we have our full clause there at the bottom, at the end. But, so far Akme Ini looks like an epistemic or a possibility modal, something like that. But you can also have a sentence like this. Katie Akame, excuse the tones, I'm doing my best here, but it's not going to come out. Katie Akame, ikot iwo. So now we have two verbs that are taking a very different inflection. And this thing is getting inflected to agree with Katie. So all of a sudden it's become a main verb and no longer any sort of modal. And then it requires different morphology on the two remaining verbs, which is ikot and iwo, which are, and this has disappeared off the end, probably nominalizers or infinitives. It's a little hard to tell, because both of them, as far as we can tell, a nominalizer or an infinitive would look roughly the same. Okay, so then I'm going to pass this back. We're going to talk about WH questions.
Very briefly.
Briefly.
It was a nice little puzzle to figure out. So briefly, WH questions in English are questions that involve what, why, when, etc. And a common thing in languages is to move that word up to the front, left to the front of the sentence. So like, what does he sing? We do in English. And in English, we can almost, in some situations, get the other way of asking this question. If he sings what, if you're exclaiming, we can leave that WH word in place. In Uda, the normal process is to move the WH words to the front of the sentence. So like, unum, I have a lot of trouble pronouncing that. Unum, who sang, or what did he sing? You can just see there, moving up with some sort of optional complementizer. I didn't mark that as optional. When we leave them in situ, when we leave the WH words in place, we also get this WH marker, se, before the verb, so se what did he or she sing? That looks like a very nice generalization. When things move up, we don't get the se. When they stay down, we do. Except that we didn't have a way to test it for the first person. So, onomu se o, we would get that, but we would also get the form without the se, and we couldn't really tell whether that was being raised. Modals, that Caroline just presented, gave us the answer to this, since they actually can separate the subject. So, in 8 here, the onomu, which person, has moved up to the front from after the modal, where we would expect it to originate. If we leave it after the modal, we get this WH marker at the beginning of the sentence. So that looks like it solves that question for us. Thank you all. I think that's the end of the session.